Welcome. This is another in a series of Scripture Roundtables presented by the Interpreter Foundation. This particular one is Gospel Doctrine, Book of Mormon, Lesson 45, the title of which is Never Has Man Believed in Me As Thou Hast. And it covers Aether chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, and chapter 6, verses 1 through 12. The purpose of this lesson is to help class members understand from the example of the brother of Jared how faith can enable us to enter the presence of the Lord eternally. My name is Martin Tanner. I'll be moderating. With me on this panel is Bruce Webster. And for reasons that will soon become apparent, I'm going to introduce Craig by his full name, Craig Mahanrai Moriankamer Foster, and we'll talk about that in a bit. We're going to start off with a background of the Book of Aether, and Bruce is going to give that to us. So it's all yours.
Okay, the Book of Aether is this sort of unique item. Now, one of the things I love about the Book of Mormon is it's a very complex narrative. You have parallel narratives, parallel history, so on and so forth. We just wrapped up the Book of Mormon, that is Mormon's book within the Book of Mormon, with Moroni saying, you know, everyone's dead. Moroni gives what actually sounds like sort of a closing statement, calling people to repentance, you know, challenging those in the last days who don't believe in Christ, and so on. It's like he suddenly finds himself with more plates than he expected, or more ore, and more time on his hands. And so he takes this book. These are the 20. This is translated from the 24 gold plates that the people of Limhi found up in desolation when they were searching for Zarahemla, veered probably too far to the east, and ended up going all the way up through into the land where the Jaredites had lived, found ruins, remains, so on, and these plates brought him back. Messiah ended up translating them and found it was a history of another group of people that the Lord had led to the American continents, and that had perished for reasons that will end up being, we'll see through this and the next lesson, end up being very similar to the reasons the Nephites perished. So Moroni, I think because he wants to drive home the point that the Nephites are not alone in their in the things that led them to destruction. And again, Moroni knows he's writing to our time, so he's trying to say, okay, sort of the mouth of two or more witnesses. Not only did the Nephites do this, let me show you that the Jaredites did this too. And in doing this, it's important to remember what a condensed and targeted version of Jaredite history we have. Aether lived at the end of what was probably roughly a 2,000, maybe 2,500 year period of Jaredite history. Wrote these 24 gold plates. They were translated by Messiah, and I'm not sure if Moroni did his own new translation here or simply had a copy of Messiah's translation. And then Moroni, you know, again, he says at the very end, he hasn't given 100th part of what he's got on Jaredite history. So he's doing a highly selective, I'm going to pick some certain things out because there are points I want to make. And as we'll see as we go through the Book of Aether, he spent several chapters, or at least 2 or 3 chapters, editorializing, not actually, you know, recounting Jaredite history. But the whole purpose here is to establish that lesson. So that's the context we have here. This is a highly selective and profoundly condensed version of Jaredite history to make a specific point, which is what happens to people who are, you know, given promises by God and then they fail to live up to their own responsibilities, their own covenants. So that's what we're looking at with Aether. It starts off. Well, I'll pass it back to Martin, and then we can start going through the chapters.
Thank you, Bruce. one of the questions that inevitably comes up is, when did this history take place? And Bruce has mentioned that it certainly covers a long, long, long time period. Some years ago, I spent a little bit of time trying to find out exactly when, at least according to Jewish history, the flood happened. And the earliest credible dates for the flood would be about 3500 BC. But most of the dates for the flood would gravitate somewhere between 3000 and 2500 BC. And so the beginning of the Jaredite record would probably be somewhere in that range. And so this is ancient writings. This is as old as some of the earliest parts of the book of Genesis. Not the very, very earliest. Adam and Eve, according to Jewish tradition, lived about 3900 BC, give or take a little bit, and Enoch was born about 3302 BC, according to Jewish tradition. So we're not quite in that arena, but we're pretty close. We're pretty close. This is very, very early. And one of the things to point out here that has always been fascinating for me is that in chapter 1 of Aether, we have a whole host of new untranslated names. These are names that you don't find in the Bible by and large. I mean, there are a few that overlap. You know, Aaron, you can find Aaron in the Bible, of course, Seth, some of the others, but many of these names are new. And one of the most remarkable things about the Book of Mormon is the number of new names and titles that Joseph Smith came up with that are absolutely amazing. And Nibley has done a great deal of work on these and found that many of them can be traced to early times, which is also fascinating and a great check on Joseph Smith's prophetic abilities here, and lead us to the idea that these plates really are of divine origin. Go ahead.
Can I just throw something in really quickly about the names? The thing about I'm very much into names because of my occupation of being a professional genealogist, and so I've actually done a lot of research on names, naming patterns, and all of that. And the one thing about the names that Joseph Smith is using throughout the Book of Mormon, but particularly you look at the names here in chapter 1, verses 7, on down, and it just keeps going and going. And these are not names that you would find in the English language. You wouldn't find in New England. You wouldn't find, in other words, usually when people like authors, when they're creating, fantasy fiction or whatever, they'll go to what they know, or nowadays it's very easy to get onto the internet and just go and find names from foreign languages. But Joseph Smith would not have had that capability, and these names don't even, there's a couple of them that might be similar, or you could say, okay, he pulled that out of his hat of having known various people. But in general, they do not follow any pattern that is that would be considered New England type names. And so this is really, to me, just being a kind of a name person, you know, that name geek is, as a lot of us like to call ourselves. These names are fascinating, and to me demonstrate that Joseph Smith wasn't just making this up off of, you know, in the back of his head, because if he had been, he would have used names that that you could trace back to New England names, or at least names that would be familiar where he might put a twist on them. And most of these names just aren't like that. So
they're not like that. One final point about the names, and that is starting in verse 6, as Craig mentioned, we have an entire list of names, and then we get to verse 33, and it says, which Jared came forth with his brother. And of course, there we have mentioned Jared's brother, and we have all these other names, but we don't have Jared's brother. And so at this point, we probably ought to ask Craig Mahanrai Moriankamer Foster if he would elaborate on the reason for that.
Yes, I will be glad to. As you said, we never have the name of the brother of Jared in the scriptures here, and so the Book of Mormon was published. The saints, people were joining the church, etc., etc., etc. Jump to Kirtland, and Reynolds Cahoon asked Joseph Smith. Practically, it's from what I gathered from reading about it, it was almost kind of spur of the moment type thing. Asked Joseph Smith, could you give our newborn son a blessing and a name? And Joseph Smith blessed the boy, the little baby boy, and gave him the name of Mahanrai Moriankamer Cahoon. And when that was over, and probably as Mrs. Cahoon was throwing Joseph out of the house, they wondered, where did that name come from? And Joseph Smith explained that it had been revealed to him that the name of the brother of Jared was Mahanrai Moriankamer. And so that is where we get Mahanrai Moriankamer. And the Cahoon family used that for several generations, if I remember correctly. Brigham Young named a son Mahanrai Moriankamer Young, who then named his son Mahanrai McIntosh Young, who happened to have been the famous artist Mahanrai Young and sculptor Mahanrai Young. But that's where you get the name of Mahanrai Moriankamer, the brother of Jared.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well done. That was fabulous.
Thanks.
And so there you go. And as you may have guessed, Craig's middle name really isn't Mahanrai Moriankamer Foster, but
no.
that was a great little segue into the name of the brother of Jared. So, all right. Just to clear that up in case anybody really thought I was serious. A couple of comments here about chapter 1, and that is that we have again in verse 35 the idea about confounding of languages, and we have an exception to the general rule that everyone's language was confounded. And it's fascinating that we have this. It's reminiscent, at least for me, of the exception to the idea that Mulek survived, when it's generally believed that that there were no children who survived the destruction of Jerusalem just after the Lehi and his group left for the New World. But they did, and we can prove that with the seal of Mulek. And now here we have this idea that there was the brother of Jared, and he and his group did not have their language confounded. And the fascinating part about that is that it gives us sort of a hint of the Adamic language. Not that we have the original language here, but we at least have some of the original names and some of the ideas that were discussed and described during the time when the Adamic language, the original language, was still in use, which to me is fascinating. Any other comments about chapter 1?
Yeah, I'll just note that I'll disagree a bit. I don't think they were speaking the Adamic language. We have well-documented languages that predate the time of the Tower of Babel. I think the confounding was probably a consequence of a sudden rise of an urban center. This has actually happened in modern times, particularly in Africa, where you've had, due to economic or political reasons, typically you have a city center grow up, and over time a common, what's the word I'm looking for? Patoi or
Well,
there's a word there for language for a anyway,
for
sort
a
of
dialect,
pidgin,
yeah.
common pidgin language, usually a mixture of languages, grows up in a city. And as new people come in, they're coming in at a relatively slow pace, and they learn and become familiar with the new language and so on. And then you have an incident where, either because of great economic incentives and coming into the city, or serious problems out in the countryside, either due to civil war, tribal warfare, famine, drought, whatever, you have this tremendous influx from a number of tribes, which all speak different languages and dialects, into the city, and they basically overload the communications within the city, because suddenly people, the city is full of people who really can't talk to each other outside of their own selective groups. And a lot of the functioning of the city starts to break down, because you no longer have a relatively stable population that all shares the common dialect or the common pidgin. That's a common pidgin language that they've been sharing, but instead can't communicate with each other. Another interesting fact is that, and this gets back to some things Craig said about Joseph Smith coming up with names. It would have been so easy for Joseph Smith to call this the Tower of Babel. He did not. He simply called it the Great Tower. The name Tower of Babel is a relatively recent name. It's not what appears in the Old Testament, and I'm not sure it is even what appears in Jewish legends. So I haven't specifically researched that. It's a relatively modern, meaning within the last several hundred years, invention of the name. And it would have been so easy for Joseph to say, it came forth at the time of the Tower of Babel, which is actually what the lesson says, and probably what the chapter summary say that. Yeah, chapter summary says Tower of Babel, but the book doesn't say Tower of Babel. It simply says the Great Tower. That to me is a hallmark of authenticity, as opposed to invention. That's something, if Joseph Smith were inventing this, he would have said Tower of Babel, and everyone said, well, yeah, we know what the Tower of Babel is. Instead, he's very consistent, simply saying the Great Tower. Finally, the other thing, and this is some of the best work on the Jaredites and their context at their time of history, is Hugh Nibley's work. In fact, I'm a little disappointed, because outside of John Sorensen, there haven't been a lot of other LDS scholars who have really dug into the Jaredites. And he did most of his work back in the 50s. You have The World of the Jaredites and There Were Jaredites. That, together with Lehi in the Desert, is collected in one volume of the collected works of Hugh Nibley. I would strongly recommend it. Nibley himself would, of course, say anything that he wrote more than 3 years ago, is questionable. He was pretty pretty quick to say, you know, things won't stand test time. But I've read that several times, and he's got some very good analysis of the milieu for this time period and what likely was taking place, because we're going to have, it may not be clear on first reading, but over the next few chapters, we're actually going to have this great migration before they ever get to the ocean, where they're going to be crossing both land and water before they actually get to the ocean and build the famous Jaredite barges. So that's probably about what I've got to say on chapter 1.
Fair enough. The word Babel certainly comes from the word Babel, or to Babylon, and references the confounding of tongues. The actual tower that is now described as the Tower of Babel is at least believed by some archaeologists to have been found, and it's an ancient ziggurat that's north, if I remember right, a little less than 50 miles of Baghdad, Iraq. And it's there's not much known about it other than its history, and so it's a fascinating find. When I say a ziggurat, the ziggurat was the stepped pyramids that preceded the shall we say triangular shaped pyramids, and so the earliest forms of pyramids of which we know were sort of step pyramids that looked like they had kind of a step pattern up to the point, and so those are known as ziggurats. And anyway, fascinating things. Chapter 2. Anyone like to start us off in chapter 2? I can do that.
I can start off. This
Okay.
this is part of the migration I was talking about. That they head for the lands northward. They go down into the valley, which is northward, with all their flocks. It's very interesting. They appear to be preparing for a large trek across relatively dry country, because they actually prepare a vessel to carry live fish with them on their initial transit. They're carrying honeybees with them as well. And Nibley has a whole discussion on, and of course other LDS scholars on Deseret and the connection with certain Egyptian words that are likewise associated with bees. And it's very interesting because it talks about that you get the sort of same thing, that they built barges in the wilderness to cross many waters. So there were waters that they were dealing with. And, you know, Nibley felt, and actually Sorensen felt for a long time, they basically started in the Mesopotamian area and headed north and east across Asia. And of course, you've got Ural Sea, Black Sea. You've got various, you know, lakes on the steppes and so on. So they're actually using some barges to cross what appear to be very large bodies of water there. As I mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention, John Sorensen most recently has come to believe that the Jaredites ended up landing on the Caribbean coast of Central America rather than the Pacific coast, mostly due to archaeological indications, the development of the what we call the Olmec City or Culture Center, which is the one most associated with the Jaredites. So you've got a potentially a different cross, I think. But in that case, if you're heading west, you're dealing with probably portions of the Mediterranean that they're trying to cross. Probably not the whole thing lengthwise, but trying to take shortcuts across. Particularly if they're heading north across the Mediterranean, you've got various places where you may be going through. And it says that they're going to quarter where there had never man been, which I suspect refers to pretty much the fact that they didn't run into much of anything. whichever direction they were heading, for talking, and let's just say 3,000, 2,500 BC. There are only certain areas where we know there were well-developed civilization centers, so it was very possible for them to travel, particularly being guided by the Lord, in areas where they're not running into people; they're simply traveling. Yeah. Anyway, so that seems to be their thing.
I have a question. It kind of makes me wonder, though, because they were, once they got into the barges, they were on the water for approximately a year.
Well, these are different barges.
Yeah, but I mean, once they get into the boats, where they wanted the rocks, etc., and so forth. If I remember correctly, that they were about a year on the water, weren't they?
I think it's 344 days.
344 days.
Yeah.
And the Atlantic is not that large.
Yeah.
So it makes me wonder, were they thrown off course a lot? I mean, to me, it always made sense with the Pacific, since the Pacific is so vast.
Well, and with the Pacific, it's not only so vast, but there is what's called the North Pacific Gyre, which is a clockwise current that goes from Japan up around and then back down the coast of North America.
Mm-hmm.
And if you throw something in the water in Japan and it actually gets caught in the gyre, it takes just about a year to get to the other side. This is why after the great earthquake and tsunami, you started having debris show up off the coast of North America roughly a year later.
Right.
So I personally, I still really prefer the Pacific route. It makes sense for a number of other reasons. And as you said, it's a little harder. I mean, the Atlantic route is harder. And it's also shorter. Well, it depends on where you launch from, but you don't have sort of that same, they're very passive. They don't have sails. They're depending upon wind and, waves, and though they don't talk about it, they're depending on current. And you really don't quite have that same transatlantic transport mechanism. So, for me, I prefer, I want to report John Sorensen says, I still like the Pacific. It actually, to me, going from Mesopotamia across Central Asia, launching from the North Asia Pacific coast and riding the Gyre all the way over and then down to somewhere, off the coast of Mexico, for me makes more geographic sense.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Anyway, so that's my two. So actually, I agree with you on that. But I feel, it's worth stating what John Sorensen currently thinks. On the other hand, we may learn things about the Olmec Culture Center that will ultimately, hopefully, learn enough about the Jaredites that we know how they meshed or how they were part of the Olmec Culture Center, what their contributions were, and it may well be that they did in fact start out on the Pacific coast rather than the Caribbean coast. All of which doesn't deal with any of the religious or theological stuff in Aether too, which is that you have, and remember, this is Moroni writing it. He sets up exactly the same situation. Jared and brother Jared are going to be led to a promised land where if they, adhere, if they follow the Lord, they will be blessed. If not, they will be wiped out. So it's the same promises and the same curses. I mean, as we saw with Lehi, and frankly, as we saw with the Israelites when they came into the promised land, and the great Joshua calling them together and basically saying, okay, guys, blessings and cursings, it's up to you. Choose you this day whom you're going to serve. Anyway, so I'll pass it back to Martin.
The Book of Aether certainly tells a story that is fascinating, and it's one that has a lot of questions associated with it. But the more you delve into those questions, the more you will actually, at least this has been the case for me, find your faith enhanced and edified. And I'll toss out a couple of ideas here. One of the first ones was the idea of no light in the barges. And so you've got this story about the glowing stones. And if you grow up in the LDS faith, as many or most who are listening to this will have done, this just sounds fine. This sounds great and ordinary because you've heard it a bunch of times. But to the people who are listening to it for the first time, it sort of sounds like the story of Ammon. You know, you hack off a bunch of arms and let's just scoop them up and take them off to the king. And if you're reading that for the first time, you go, what is going on here? And here it's a similar kind of thing. Glowing stones. How do you get glowing stones to light up a bunch of barges? It sounds almost over the top. But with that little background, it then becomes a huge matter of testimony and faith to hear that Joseph Smith didn't just come up with something that sounds over the top, that if you were to do research, you would find that in a number of ancient Jewish sources, the way the ark was lit and had light was with glowing stones that were given to Noah by God. And this is ancient Jewish non-biblical sources that Joseph Smith would have had no access to. So how did he come up with the same method that the Jews had known about for millennia that he would not have had access to? It's another indicia of the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon. Another one that was brought to my attention many, many years ago is in Aether chapter 2, verse 23, where the Lord's talking to the brother of Jared saying, well, what do you want me to do so that you can have light? You can't have windows because they would be dashed to pieces. And people will say, what are you talking about? Glass windows here, 2500 BC? That's ridiculous. And I remember wondering about that and delving into how early it was that there were actually windows that could shatter, that weren't just made of some kind of a cloth or something, because this talks about dashed into pieces. This is clearly some kind of a solid object. And it turns out that there are early kinds of windows that were made just to let in light, that were glass, but not clear glass the way we would have them today. They're known as early as 3700 BC. And so this is well within the time period where people knew about windows that could be dashed. They wouldn't have been crystal clear from your local glass company. That they would have been nonetheless clear enough to allow light to come in. So I thought that was fascinating as well. And a final one, you have these three problems that the brother of Jared's trying to solve. No light, and that's taken care of with the glowing stones. You have the steering issue, which is taken care of with the wind and the currents. And then you have no air in the boat. And people also look at this whole idea of stopping up a hole and unstopping it and wondering how that would work. And it turns out that some of the earliest methods for submarines use that very same kind of a thing. They would open up a hole that was on the top of the submarine, and if the weather got bad or they needed to submerge, there was a lever that could be placed over to hold something in place to cover up the holes. Very, very similar to the description that we have here in the Book of Aether. So technology that's unusual and that would not have been known to Joseph Smith turns out to be accurately described in the Book of Aether, which to me is fascinating and also very, very faith promoting.
Yeah,
And
one
with
more
that,
point.
I'll turn the baton over to someone else.
One more
Please.
point about the barges. These are often mocked as, Jaredite submarines. But it's very clear if you actually read the text, which of course most Book of Mormon critics don't, that it's only referring to waves breaking over it. And trust me, if you've ever seen footage of a surface ship in heavy weather, you will see waves coming over it. Well, these were apparently built to sit relatively low in the water, which is why they had to be watertight. It makes it very clear these are watertight. And exactly to Martin's point, you had a watertight door at top, and you could open that up, and you could get air coming in and out and so on. And you could close it, and it would be watertight, so nothing would get in. And if that door is closed, you have another watertight door in the bottom of the boat. And you see this on certain submarines and other submersible vessels. You open the door in the bottom, because the top one is closed, water doesn't come rushing in, and you have immediate access to the ocean. This allows you to fish, and it also allows you to get rid of any waste materials. So you've got a built-in latrine and fishing port. So long as you keep that top door closed tight, and you just have this well of water there. I mean, if you've actually watched movies or footage, you will see this is often used in some types of submarines. I mean, regular submarines don't worry about that, but ones where it's particular research subs where you want access to the ocean, they will have a room like that where you can go in and out of the water without this, having to go up and walk across the top and jump into the water, because that's riskier. So again, exactly to Martin's point, when you read the text carefully, it's like, this is pretty brilliant and accurate stuff. And again, we're talking about a 23-year-old farm boy in upstate New York in the early 1800s. To try and think, oh well, Joseph was just really clever. I am staggered at times at the self-gullibility of a lot of Book of Mormon critics, who seem to think everything can be explained by Joseph's access to the contents of the British Library and 20th century scientific thinking. Anyway.
Wonderful, great comments. Anything else on chapter 2? Okay, let's move on to chapter 3. In chapter 3, we have the description of the 16 stones that were touched by the finger of God, and that were used to light the barges. Those are described in verse 1. We also have descriptions here about the great faith that was with the brother of Jared, so that he was actually able to see Jesus Christ. And here we have some fascinating descriptions, because certainly here we see that the pre-existent Christ has a physical body. He has, fingers, toes. He's a person. He is a divine person. But apparently this is not precisely the way that he was understood to be, at least until this point, by the brother of Jared. I'm not necessarily saying that they believed in just a spirit, or that they didn't have the idea of God as a divine person. But this is something that is described in verse 6 as It was the finger of a man like unto flesh and blood, and the brother of Jared fell down before the Lord, for he was struck with fear. Clearly, this is something that gave the brother of Jared cause to be fearful. This is not just reverence; he is afraid, and that may be because nothing like this has ever happened before, or he is not expecting it, or his concept of God is less complete. But for whatever reason, this is an amazing and powerful experience, and in some ways also reminiscent a little bit of Joseph Smith in his first vision. When Joseph Smith had his first vision, he didn't really know what to expect, and in one of the accounts that's not part of our scriptures, Joseph Smith describes the light being brighter and brighter above the brightness of the noonday sun, and it came down, and this is a paraphrase, but Joseph Smith said that he thought the whole forest was going to be burned up, and he was going to be burned up with it, and he receives this great amount of relief when the light hits him, and he doesn't burn up, and he has this great feeling of love and joy, and that's a similar kind of experience, at least analogous to the one that we have described here. We have something where the brother of Jared starts out with genuine fear in verse 6, and later on he's described as having great faith, greater faith than anyone else, certainly up until this time, has ever had. So those would be my main points for chapter 3.
Just one thing, I know you didn't mean it this way, but Christ doesn't have a physical body. In fact, Christ makes it clear, I'm going to take upon myself flesh and blood. This is the body of my spirit. Now that alone is of course, very dramatic doctrinal break with traditional Christianity, right there, and is the first indication within LDS doctrine of this notion of having a pre-existent spirit body that is in a form at least similar to the form that we're going to end up taking in this lifetime. The other interesting thing is, and this is a wonderful chapter, and Moroni cuts it short and basically says there's a lot more that I can't tell you. But that said, it is worth going through this chapter and seeing the interaction between the brother of Jared, who is literally seeking more light, with the Savior and the temple. It is a request. A request is granted. Brother Jared gains more knowledge, literally gains light in the shape of the glowing stones, and then you have his reaction to seeing the finger of the Lord, and you have this back and forth where he's being asked questions, he's given responses, and it ends up that he cannot be withheld from being outside of the veil anymore, and basically enters into the presence of the Lord and learns all this stuff that he can't write about as the process of it. So, for those who've been through the temple, reading Aether 3 there are some very interesting parallels that you may note there as far as what's going on between the brother of Jared. The other interesting thing is, after all this, the Lord tells them, write this down, don't suffer it to come, I've confounded the other languages, people aren't going to be able to write what you read, and I've prepared these 2 stones, these interpreters. These, I mean, it's hard to trace the actual history and who had possession of them when, but these appear to be the ones that end up coming down all the way to Aether. They appear to be ones that are found by Mosiah's expedition up into the land desolation. And and Mosiah uses them, and they get handed down. Moroni has them at this point, and they get buried by Moroni with the plates, and Joseph Smith gets them. They're you know, I don't know if there were as much as with the plates where Moroni sort of comes and goes with the plates a few times during the translation of the Book of Mormon. I don't know what divine protection there may have been through the course of the history of the Jaredites, and frankly from the time of Mosiah all the way to the time of Moroni for these interpreters. But there does appear to be a path basically from the time of the brother of Jared all the way down to Joseph Smith for these interpreters to serve this function, to help write or reveal things that are necessary for the Lord's work to go forward.
You know, one thing that you're talking about how the brother of Jared reacted when he saw the finger, and you know, he was afraid. I can't help but wonder. You know, we're talking about people who lived a long time ago who. Well, I'm not even going to say it that way because, quite frankly, if I saw the finger of the Lord, I think I'd be scared to death too. But it makes me wonder if when he saw the finger of the Lord, if he didn't for a moment think, you know, I've just seen the finger of the Lord, I am going to die now, you know, because having actually seen a part of God. And so that's how I've always kind of interpreted that the fear was he was thinking, oh no, yeah, I've gone a little too far. I've seen this, and now I'll probably be destroyed. You know, but you know, I mean that's gospel according to Craig, but that's kind of been my thought, was that he was afraid that. Oh, I saw this by accident, and now I'm going to suffer the consequences thereof.
Well, I think that's actually an excellent observation, and I think it's very consistent, particularly I think with ancient Near Eastern concepts of deity and, you know, approaching deity, and I mean it's sort of the same theme that's echoed at Sinai with, you know, you need all this preparation to see the Lord or you'll be destroyed in the process. So no, I think your point is directly on.
Well, that's actually right, and it's reminiscent of Jacob wrestling with God, and then afterwards naming the place Peniel because he is shocked and amazed. I've seen God and I've lived to tell about it. That's the concept. Great observation, Craig. And Bruce, thank you for correcting my Freudian slip there about God in the in the physical sense. I was sort of using the description as opposed to being a spirit. But
yeah, no, I knew what you meant. I just didn't want anyone listening to this to think. I mean, I knew you knew what you were saying, and the idea that God has an actual shape as opposed to just some.
Exactly, as an actual shape. Yeah. Well, you know what? You're giving me too much credit if you think I always know what I'm saying, because I really don't. But yeah, Jesus appeared in the form of a person, in the form of a man, and that's the point I was going to make. And I just wanted to follow up with one other point based on the idea that's already been expressed about the great faith of the brother of Jared. Verse 25 says that the Lord showed unto the brother of Jared all the inhabitants of the earth, which had been. In other words, he saw all the past history of the earth. And then he sees all the future of the earth till the very end. Nothing is withheld. He sees everything. That is quite remarkable. And that's kind of a wonderful summary for what.
And that's actually a very interesting echo of Moses chapter 1, where the Lord does much the same thing with Moses, and for that matter, the Enoch's great vision in Moses chapter 7. So this is something the Lord does from time to time with certain prophets, is basically say, here's everything, now you know what has happened and what's going to happen.
Which is just incredible when you think about it. I don't know if my finite mind could even begin to comprehend. So trying to think of in the place of Mahanrai Mariankama or Moses or Enoch, here it's all laid out before you, and obviously not only they are quickened, but their mind is quickened to be able to comprehend, I would think. Just a thought there.
Thank you. Great comments. Chapter 4. Anyone like to jump into to chapter 4? I don't have
this is what.
Here, so.
I'm sorry. This is one of Moroni's editorial injections. He basically is talking about why he's doing this. He's drawing parallels between what Aether has done, or actually in this case what the brother of Jared has done. Says, I've actually written what the brother of Jared has done on the plates. That's what we believe is in the sealed portions. Remember, Joseph Smith only translated a third of the plates. There were 2/3 of the plates had from the descriptions, metal bands around them, so you couldn't even look at them. And we have a promise of that coming forth at some point. So he says, I've done it. I've sealed it up. I've sealed up the interpreters. And the Lord says they won't go back until the Gentiles, until the days shall repent of their iniquity, be complete before the Lord, which to me sounds like the millennium, quite frankly. So I'm not sure if we'll get to see them any sooner than that. And then you have him quoting the Lord, calling us in our time to repentance, both the house of Israel and all the ends of the earth. And so this is a editorial and revelatory interjection, as opposed to any actual information. And I'll simply note here, the lesson 5 isn't covered, or chapter 5 isn't covered in lesson. That simply talks about witnesses, that there will be witnesses to the work that's coming forward. So 4 and 5 are really Mormon recording, both doing his own editorializing and then recording promises and revelations from the Lord.
Okay. Anything else for chapter 4? Let's move on to chapter 6. We just have a few verses here, 1 through 12. Here we have sort of the actual fruits of faith and labor, as it were. We have the description here about the actual use of the stones, and that they did give light to the barges. And verse 4 talks about preparations. And so we know about the detailed preparations that went into this lengthy journey. And it talks about preparing food, flocks, herds, beasts, animals, fowl, and it talks about them on the barges. So these were significant barges. These weren't just canoes with the top. These were large barges. They were significant.
And do we have any idea how large they were? I don't ever remember reading any description like you get with Noah's Ark, for example. I think it's left up to us to try to imagine how big they were. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, there's no indication of the size other than the fact that
they're listing all the stuff that goes in.
Yeah.
So that's pretty significant there. That's quite a bit.
In verse 16, we say the friends of Jared and his brother were in number about 20 souls. So we have them plus Jared and the brother of Jared, and whatever families they have setting off. There are 8 barges, and I suspect that one thing that isn't answered here is how the barges stayed together. Now, stuff tends to drift together again when you're in a current like this. I don't know if they had long ropes that were tied to each other to try and sort of keep each other. One interesting thing, and I speak as someone who has vivid memories of crossing the Pacific Ocean twice in a Navy passenger ship, and one of those times basically hitting the outskirts of a typhoon and being horribly seasick for most of the transit. To the extent that these barges tend to ride very low in the water, that's a great stabilizing effect for seasickness, because these are landlubbers. They find themselves in closed barges with livestock. I can only imagine the smell. But they're riding low in the water. The waves are tending to break over them, and so on. And they have light inside, and basically says they spent a lot of time singing. I don't know that the barges were terribly big, but they were big enough to hold flocks so they could continue to eat through these 344 days. And they have other food which it talks about them bringing with them. In fact, they have to bring food for their flocks and herds. So I suspect that the barges, the reason they had 8 barges, I strongly suspect, particularly when you look at the crew sizes of, say, Columbus's ships and how many people were on what were really tiny ships. I suspect having 8 barges for a relatively small number of people was because most of the barge was food for the animals, food for themselves. And it was it may well have been divided up by families. Brother of Jared had one, Jared had one for him and his family, and then their 22 friends are divided among the other 6 barges. And so that, most of what they would need, this is a supply issue. So most of what they would need are going to be the supplies that they can bring with them to do this transit. That's my sort of 2 cents there.
Sure. Well, great comments. Two quick follow-ups to those. One is that these don't have to be shaped well. In other words, a pointed front or something of that nature. Noah's Ark was just supposed to float, and it was a rectangle. And these barges, although they have peaked ends, these are not particularly aerodynamic. There's no reason for that. They're just floating with the currents. These are a little bit like rafts, and they have to be, Bruce, as you said, tethered together. There is zero chance that 8 barges would float along and stay within proximity. They probably had some kind of multi-redundant tethering system or something, and vast amounts of rope. And this is another reason why the Pacific crossing seems by far the most likely. Try to have 8 tethered barges go around Cape Horn, Africa in 24-foot waves. It's just, you would have dead animals and dead people and just all kinds of carnage. Better to take a much longer period of time and have more of a leisurely crossing across the Pacific. And so I, as you both mentioned earlier, highly favor the idea of a Pacific crossing. Here in chapter 6, in verse 11, we have the 344 days that Bruce mentioned earlier. See, he knows all these things. He doesn't have to have the reference. But for the rest of us, here it is. And we have an analogy made in verse 7 to it being tight like unto a dish, tight like unto the ark of Noah, indicating that these were divinely inspired ships or barges, such as the divinely inspired construct of the ark. And the analogy is to a dish. Dishes were known in ancient times to be, of course, able to hold water, otherwise they wouldn't be very useful. And these, unlike many of the contemporary boats that would have been made during that time period, were tight like unto a dish and didn't tend to leak, otherwise they would not have lasted for the 344 days. And with that,
speaking as a one thing really quickly I want to mention, Bruce made reference to landlubbers, and Bruce has been in the Navy. I am a landlubber through and through. I get on a ferry. That's the most I've ever been on. Is a ferry crossing the Irish Sea or the English Channel or something like that. And that right there is enough for me. Now, imagine these people who I'm going to venture to guess were, as Bruce said, landlubbers. And you look at verse 7 where it says, "And when they were encompassed about by many waters, they did cry unto the Lord, and he did bring them forth again upon the top of the waters." All I have to say is it took incredible faith for these people to get their flocks, to get their food, enough that it's obvious to them, we're going to be in these things for a while. And you plop yourself into the ocean. You have no way of steering these boats. They're just going along with the current, and you're having the waves, come over them. It takes an incredible amount of faith, and just kind of putting it in that perspective. It's an amazing story right there, and an amazing example of faith that they were going to survive this voyage.
Just two more comments. Well, actually, first, I was in the Navy. I was a Navy brat. I was 5 on the way out to the Philippines and 7 years old coming back.
Oh, okay.
And I still have vivid memories of those.
I bet.
Just two more points. One is, people may wonder, and this ties back to what we talked about earlier about the name of the Brother of Jared. Brother of Jared is never named here. Aether's record is a lineage record. It only covers the direct regnal, the reigning descent line from Jared, not from the brother of Jared. And what you'll actually find in later chapters is there are a few times when the kingship goes over to someone who is not in that single line of descent, and they don't mention the name of the king. You literally have someone reigning and the king is never named until power goes back to someone who is in this one particular direct descent line from Jared, which is interesting. Second thing is the one logistic thing that isn't covered here is, what did they do for water? The typical thing for cultures that make long voyages is you capture rainwater. You usually do this, and this gets back to what Martin said. There's probably a large flat area on top, and you tend to put out collectors, usually with a funnel type top, so that you have rain coming down. You collect it, and with a heavy rain, you can collect an amazing amount of water in a relatively short time. And you can actually build, in their case, you could have built the same thing into that one opening doorway as well. In other words, have a funnel-like, very large funnel-like device that you simply deploy out there, and in a rainstorm, you basically have water, fresh water coming in, and you fill up each of your water barrels or whatever you're using to hold water while the rainstorm is going, and then you collapse it and close it up again. Anyway, so for those who ask, well, what do they do for water? This is an issue that seafaring civilizations, pre-Columbian seafaring civilization, and frankly, Columbus had to deal with it too, have dealt with for millennia.
Craig, any other comments?
Nope.
All good to go. All right. Thank you for joining us for this Interpreter Roundtable on Book of Mormon Lesson 45. Our participants have been Craig Foster and Bruce Webster. I'm Martin Tanner. Thank you for joining us. I hope you'll join us for other roundtables and spend some time on the Interpreter website. There are other wonderful things there as well.